A 7-year-old little girl waits nervously in the schoolyard for her kindergarten graduation ceremony, desperate because she had promised her classmates that her dad would arrive at any moment. When she sees an elegant man about to step into a luxury car, she rushes over, clasps her hands in a plea, and begs, "Sir, could you be my dad at my graduation? All the fathers came except mine. Please." The man looks at her desperate face, then at the school full of happy families, and his heart tightens. He asks her to just wait a minute and leaves in his car, leaving the child sobbing, convinced she's been let down. But what happens minutes later changes everything. The late afternoon sun painted the yard of Northwood Elementary School with golden hues, as the scent of flowers from the small school garden mingled with the sweet aroma of homemade treats prepared by the mothers for the ceremony. Sophia clutched the blank diploma she would receive in a few minutes, her 7 years carrying a weight far heavier than they should. Her small fingers trembled not from nervousness about the graduation, but from the secret she had kept for weeks. "My mum brought fudge brownies for everyone!" shouted Charlie, waving at a smiling woman carrying a colorful tray. "And my dad came, straight from work just to see me." Sophia forced a smile as she watched families organize themselves in the yard. Mothers adjusted bows in their daughters' hair. Fathers took photos with cell phones. Grandparents distributed proud kisses. The little girl's heart tightened when she saw the empty chair in the first row where her special companion should have been seated. For weeks, she had made up stories about her father for her classmates. She claimed he worked far away, that he was very important, that he would arrive by surprise at the graduation. The lies came so naturally that sometimes she almost believed them herself. She almost forgot that she lived only with Grandma Lourdes, the 85-year-old woman who had barely been able to get out of bed for months. "Sophia, where's your dad?" asked Beatrice, the most popular girl in class, looking around with malicious curiosity. "You said he was coming." "He's coming, he's coming," Sophia replied too quickly, her voice higher than usual. He's stuck in traffic." But time passed, and the lie weighed heavier and heavier. Ms. Marcia, the teacher, began to organize the children into a line, explaining how the ceremony would proceed. Each graduate would enter hand in hand with their family member, receive their diploma, and take a special photo. Sophia felt tears burn her eyes when she realized she would be the only one without a companion. It was then that she saw the man. Tall, elegant, wearing an impeccable grey suit that contrasted with his serious, distant expression. He walked briskly toward a gleaming black car parked right in front of the school. He seemed important, the kind of person Sophia imagined when she dreamed of a father. His grey hair was neatly combed, his shoes gleamed in the sun, and there was something in his posture that conveyed authority and success. Without thinking twice, Sophia broke from the line and ran toward him. Mister, wait!" she shouted, her sandals slapping on the hot asphalt. The man stopped, surprised, and turned to the girl who was running toward him, her braids bouncing, and her eyes already wet with tears. Sophia reached him breathless, clasped her small hands in supplication, and raised her face, letting all her vulnerability show. "Mister, could you be my dad at my graduation?" The words came out in a desperate whisper. "All the other dads came except mine. Please!" The man froze. There was something in those tear-filled brown eyes that hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he hadn't allowed himself to feel anything. He had built such high walls around his heart that he believed nothing could penetrate them. But there, a child completely vulnerable was pleading for something so simple yet so complex. I have to go," he mumbled, more to himself than to her. Sophia saw the hesitation in his eyes and clung to hope like someone clinging to a rope to avoid falling into an abyss. "It's just a little graduation, mister, just so I'm not alone in front of everyone. Everyone has a dad except me." Her voice broke on the last word. The man looked at his car, then at the school, finally at the girl who had placed all her hope in the hands of a stranger. A silent battle raged within him, decades of emotional protection against a desperate plea from a child. "Wait here," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Just a minute." He got into the car and drove off, leaving Sophia standing there in the middle of the street, watching her last hopes recede with the black car disappearing around the corner. Sophia returned to the graduation line with slumped shoulders and a broken heart. The other children were already being organized by Ms. Marcia, who efficiently checked names on her list with maternal care. The yard buzzed with activity. Mothers adjusted their children's clothes. Fathers tested cameras. Grandparents looked for the best spots to watch the ceremony. "Sophia, dear, where were you?" asked the teacher, noticing the girl's red eyes. "And your companion? You said your dad was coming." Sophia's throat closed up. The words refused to come out, caught in a knot of shame and despair. She just shook her head, unable to admit aloud that she had been rejected once again. The lie she had told for weeks now weighed on her shoulders like a giant stone. He left," she finally whispered, her voice almost inaudible. Ms. Marcia knelt down to the girl's height, her face expressing a mix of compassion and concern. She knew Sophia's situation, knew the difficulties the child faced at home with her sick grandmother. She had tried to contact Grandma Lourdes several times, but the old woman could barely answer the phone on her better days. "Don't worry, my love," the teacher said, stroking the girl's face. "You can walk in with me. I'll be your family today." But the children around had already noticed the situation. Whispers began softly, then grew like ripples spreading across a calm lake. "Sophia really doesn't have a dad," muttered Beatrice to a group of classmates. "I knew she was lying," added another boy. "My mum said she lives only with a sick old lady." "Poor thing," one of the girls feigned compassion, but her eyes sparkled with the typical malice of children who find someone more vulnerable than themselves. Sophia felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Each whisper was like a needle, prick in her chest. She had spent weeks building a fantasy, inventing a perfect father to impress her classmates, and now everything was collapsing before dozens of curious and judgmental eyes. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Edward Montgomery drove his Mercedes down the main avenue, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. At 52, he owned one of the largest construction companies in the region, a man accustomed to making multi-million-dollar decisions without hesitation. But the desperate plea of a 7-year-old girl had shaken the very foundations of his soul, which he thought were permanently armored. "What madness is this?" he mumbled to himself, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing by leaving. "I can't get involved in a strange child's life. I can't—" But the image of those tear-filled eyes wouldn't leave his mind. The way she clasped her hands in supplication, the pure vulnerability in her broken voice. Edward had spent the last 8 years avoiding any situation that might awaken paternal feelings he had buried, along with his own dreams of a family. He stopped at a red light and looked at his watch. The ceremony was supposed to start in 15 minutes. He imagined the girl returning to the line alone, facing the humiliation of being the only one without a companion. He imagined the moment. She would have to walk alone to the makeshift stage, while all the other children were accompanied by their proud parents. "It's not my problem," he repeated like a mantra, but his voice sounded less convincing with each repetition. The light turned green and he drove on, but his hands were sweating and his heart pounded. A silent war raged within him. On one side, 8 years of self-imposed emotional isolation, the conscious decision never to allow himself to love anyone again to avoid suffering. On the other, the memory of that desperate little voice just asking not to be alone. Edward had learned the hard way that emotional involvement meant becoming vulnerable to pain. He had sworn he would never again allow anyone the power to destroy him again. But something in the child's desperate sincerity had pierced all his defenses like a direct arrow. At the school, the ceremony was about to begin. Sophia occupied the last spot in the line, trying to become invisible. Miss Marcia made a final adjustment to the microphone and began her opening speech, talking about achievements, growth, and the fundamental support of families in the educational process. Every word was torture for Sophia, who kept her eyes fixed on the ground, counting the ants marching between the stones in the yard. She didn't want to see the happy families, didn't want to witness what she could never have. It was then that she heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the school. Sophia's heart raced when she recognized the engine sound. She slowly raised her eyes, almost disbelieving, and saw the same black car stopping in exactly the same spot as before. But this time, something was different. The man got out of the vehicle carrying a bouquet of colorful flowers that looked like something out of a magazine and an elegant box that Sophia couldn't identify from a distance. Conversations in the yard gradually quieted as adults noticed the arrival of the well-dressed stranger. Edward Montgomery walked toward the school with firm steps, but his heart pounded unevenly. In the last 15 minutes, he had stopped in 3 different places: a fancy downtown florist, a famous gourmet pastry shop, and finally in front of a gas station bathroom mirror where he tried to understand what madness he was committing. "Excuse me," he addressed Ms. Marcia, who observed him with evident curiosity. I'm Sophia's father." The words came out more easily than he expected, although a voice in his head screamed that he was lying to an educator. Sophia felt her legs weaken. He had come back. The elegant man had really come back for her. "Oh!" the teacher smiled, clearly relieved. "How wonderful you could make it. Sophia was so worried. She said you were stuck in traffic." Edward looked at the girl, who stared at him with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Her eyes sparkled like stars, and for the first time that afternoon, a genuine smile illuminated her small face. "I apologize for the delay," he said, surprising himself with the naturalness of his own words. "I had to sort out some important things before coming." Sophia ran to him, and Edward instinctively knelt to be at the girl's height. For a moment, he thought she would hug him, but Sophia restrained herself, maintaining a respectful distance. There was something in her eyes that touched him deeply. Not just gratitude, but a sad wisdom of someone who had been disappointed many times. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered, so softly that only he could hear. Edward felt something break inside his chest. He extended the bouquet to her, watching her eyes widen at the perfect flowers. "These are for you, princess, to celebrate your graduation." The murmur in the yard increased. Some mothers exchanged curious glances, clearly impressed by the man's elegance and the obvious quality of the flowers. Edward noticed the attention they were attracting and opened the box of gourmet chocolates. "And these," he announced loudly, "enough for everyone to hear, are to share with all your classmates. After all, you're all graduating today." The reaction was immediate. The children approached with excitement when they saw the perfectly aligned gourmet chocolates in the luxurious box. These were treats most of them had never tasted, individually wrapped with tiny gold ribbons. "Holy cow, what fancy chocolate!" exclaimed Charlie, momentarily forgetting his manners. "Sophia, your dad is so cool," said Beatrice, who just minutes before had been whispering mean comments. Now her voice carried thinly disguised envy. Suddenly, Sophia was no longer the lonely girl without a family who caused pity. She had become the child whose father had brought the best gifts to the ceremony. The transformation was instantaneous and magical. Classmates who had ignored her now approached with interested smiles, wanting to know more about the elegant man who distributed imported chocolates. Edward observed everything with a mix of satisfaction and discomfort. He had bought those expensive treats on impulse without thinking about the consequences. Now he realized he had created a complex situation. The other children looked at him. With admiration, some parents whispered among themselves, clearly trying to figure out who this well-dressed man was, whom they didn't recognize from the public school social circle. "Daddy," Sophia tested the word carefully, "are you staying for the whole ceremony?" The simple question hit him like lightning. Daddy, a word he hadn't heard in years, that he had learned to avoid in movies, conversations, memories, but coming from that little girl's lips, it sounded different. It sounded like a possibility he had never considered. "Of course," he replied before his rational mind could interfere. "I wouldn't miss your graduation for anything, Mins." Marcia clapped her hands, getting everyone's attention. "Let's begin our ceremony. Families, please take your seats. Children, let's form a line for the processional." Sophia held Edward's hand with a confidence that surprised him. Her small, warm hand in his awakened sensations he had buried deep. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if this were real, if she were truly his daughter, if this moment wasn't based on a desperate lie. But as they walked to their seats, Edward couldn't ignore the curious glances of the other parents, nor the growing feeling that he was getting involved in something much bigger than he had imagined. The solemn music played on the small school sound system echoed through the yard as the children formed an orderly line. Sophia was radiant, holding the bouquet of flowers as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Beside her, Edward tried to process the surreal situation he was in, dressed in a suit at a public school, about to participate in the graduation of a child he had met less than an hour ago. "Ladies and gentlemen, dear families," Miss Marcia announced, into the slightly crackling microphone, "welcome to the pre-K graduation ceremony for our beloved kindergarten class." Applause echoed through the yard, decorated with colorful banners made by the children themselves. Edward noticed how simple everything was there, yet filled with affection. The decorations were handmade, the plastic chairs borrowed from the neighborhood church, the stage improvised with wooden planks. Even so, or perhaps because of it, there was an atmosphere of genuine celebration that he hadn't experienced in years in his sophisticated social circles. "Now, we invite each graduate to receive their diploma from the hands of their special family member," the teacher continued. "First, we call Beatrice Santos, accompanied by her mommy." Sophia squeezed Edward's hand as they watched Beatrice proudly walk to the stage with her mother. The woman, visibly emotional, handed the diploma to her daughter and posed for photos taken by relatives who squeezed in to get the best angle. "Olivia Peterson, accompanied by her daddy." Edward observed the man in a mechanic's uniform, clearly straight from work, his hands still slightly stained with grease, but his eyes shining with pride. He had taken time off to be there, probably sacrificing half a day's wages to see his daughter receive that piece of paper that meant so much. Charlie Miller, accompanied by his grandma. An old woman with a cane slowly climbed the improvised steps, helped by her grandson. The boy patiently waited for her to balance before taking the diploma, then hugged her with a tenderness that made Edward swallow hard. "Sophia Mendes," Miss Marcia finally announced, accompanied by her daddy. Edward's heart pounded. There he was, being publicly announced as the father of a child he didn't know. But when he looked at Sophia, he saw such pure happiness in her eyes that any hesitation momentarily disappeared. They walked together to the stage. Sophia walked on her tiptoes, trying to look taller, while Edward felt the curious gazes of everyone present. Some mothers whispered among themselves, clearly trying to remember if they had seen this man before at school meetings. Ms. Marcia handed the diploma to Edward, who knelt to be at Sophia's height. The moment seemed suspended in time. He held the paper decorated with children's drawings and handed it to her with a solemnity that surprised them both. "Congratulations, Sophia," he said, and his voice came out more emotional than he intended. "You earned this with a lot of hard work." Sophia held the diploma with both hands, as if it were made of crystal. Her eyes filled with tears of pure happiness. For a magical moment, she truly felt like any other child there, loved, supported, celebrated. "Daddy," she whispered, and this time the word came out more naturally. "Thank you for being here." The volunteer school photographer positioned them for the official photo. Edward placed his hand on Sophia's shoulder, feeling the fragility of her small bones under the simple but clean dress. She smiled at the camera with a joy that radiated to everyone around. The flash fired, immortalizing that impossible moment. When they descended from the stage, they were surrounded by other families. Some mothers approached with curious smiles, wanting to strike up a conversation with the well-dressed man they didn't recognize. "We haven't seen you at parent-teacher conferences," one of them commented with false cordiality. "You must work. A lot, I imagine." Edward felt the weight of the scrutiny. Each question was a potential trap. Each answer could expose the charade they had created. "Yes, I travel a lot for work," he replied vaguely, pulling Sophia closer. "But I wouldn't miss my daughter's graduation for anything." Sophia looked at him with admiration when he called her "my daughter." The words sounded so natural that for an instant she forgot that all of this was just a temporary act. The ceremony continued with a small community snack. Edward watched Sophia interact with her classmates, noticing how she had transformed since his arrival. The shy, humiliated girl had become the center of attention, surrounded by children who wanted to be her friends. But he also noticed something more subtle. The way she looked at him from time to time, as if wanting to make sure he was still there, that he wouldn't disappear like a dream. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that went beyond the immediate situation, a deep need that single afternoon could not fill. When the ceremony officially ended and families began to disperse, Edward realized that the moment of truth had arrived. Sophia approached him, still holding the diploma and the flowers, but her expression had changed. The glow of happiness was still there, but mixed with something that looked like fear. The schoolyard was almost empty when Sophia finally mustered the courage to approach Edward. He was putting his cell phone back in his pocket after taking a quick call from the office, trying to maintain appearances of normality on a day that had been anything but normal. "Mr. she began, then quickly corrected herself. "Daddy, can you take me home?" The simple question carried a weight Edward hadn't anticipated. Of course, she would expect him to take her home. Any father would do that after his daughter's graduation. But he wasn't her father, and he had no idea where she lived or what her family situation truly was. "Of course," he replied, though a voice in his head screamed warnings. "Where do you live?" Sophia hesitated, looking down at her feet. Her simple sandals contrasted dramatically with Edward's Italian shoes. She knew the moment of truth had arrived, that she could no longer maintain the fantasy she had created. It's kind of far from here," she murmured. "At the very edge of town, past the old gas station. There's a little dirt road." "It's there." Edward nodded, trying to appear natural. "All right, let's go in my car." The black Mercedes drew even more attention as they approached it. Sophia had never been in such a luxurious car. The leather seats smelled new, the dashboard gleamed, and there were buttons she couldn't even imagine the purpose of. She settled into the passenger seat, holding the diploma and flowers like talismans. For the first few minutes of the drive, they maintained a comfortable silence. Edward drove slowly, following Sophia's whispered directions. As they moved away from the city centre, the streets progressively became narrower and more run down. Large houses gave way to simple constructions, then to wooden and tin shacks. "Mister," Sophia broke the silence suddenly, her voice tiny, "I need to tell you something." Edward felt his stomach clench. There was something in her tone that foreshadowed an important revelation. "Go ahead," he encouraged, keeping his eyes on the bumpy road. I lied to you." The words came out in a whisper laden with guilt. "I don't have a dad. I never have. I live only with Grandma Lourdes, but she's not my real grandma. She found me when I was a tiny baby and raised me." Edward pulled the car over to the side of the road. He needed to process that information, looking at her. Sophia shrank into the seat, expecting to be rejected again. "Grandma Lourdes is very sick," she continued, tears starting to stream down. "She can barely get out of bed. Sometimes she can't even make me food. I'm the one who takes care of her, brings her water, tidies up the house." The image Edward had mentally constructed began to unravel. He had imagined a simple but structured family, not a 7-year-old child alone caring for an elderly, sick woman. "Everyone at school has a mom and dad," Sophia sobbed. "I invented that I had an important dad who traveled a lot. I invented so many stories that sometimes even I believed them. But when I saw you there, so elegant, I thought you could pretend to be my dad just for a little while, just so I wouldn't be embarrassed at graduation." Edward felt as if someone had squeezed his lungs. The responsibility of what he had done hit him with full force. He hadn't just participated in an innocent charade. He had become part of the life of a child who was clearly in a vulnerable situation. "Sophia," he said carefully, "where exactly do you live? What's your house like?" "It's a shack," she admitted, shame evident in her voice. "It leaks when it rains. Grandma Lourdes sleeps on an old bed, and I sleep on a bed she made with crates and a thin mattress. There's no water inside the house. I get it from the community spigot around the corner. But Grandma Lourdes loves me very much, and I love her too." The last sentence was said with a fierce pride that touched Edward deeply. Even amidst extreme poverty, Sophia spoke of love with absolute certainty. "Why didn't you tell the school, the teacher?" he asked. "Grandma Lourdes is afraid they'll take me away from her," Sophia explained, with the sad wisdom of someone who grew up too fast. "She says, some people don't understand that love doesn't need a signed paper, so I never tell anyone she's sick, that sometimes there's no food, that I'm the one who takes care of her." Edward remained silent for long minutes, absorbing the magnitude of the situation. A 7-year-old child living in precarious conditions, caring for a sick elderly woman, keeping secrets to protect the only family she knew. And he had gotten involved in all of this on impulse. "Sophia," he finally said, "will you show me where your house is?" She nodded, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "Are you going to leave after you see where I live?" she asked with a vulnerability that broke his heart. Edward looked at that brave little girl who had faced the world alone for so long, who had risked everything in a desperate plea to a stranger, and felt something stir in his chest, something he had sworn never to feel again. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But first, I need to meet Grandma Lourdes. I need to truly understand your situation." Sophia smiled for the first time since she began her confession. "She'll like you," she said with conviction. "Grandma Lourdes always says there are angels disguised in the world. I think you're one of them." The black Mercedes seemed absurdly out of place on the dirt road. Edward drove slowly, avoiding the larger potholes, while observing the progressively transforming landscape. Brick houses gave way to makeshift constructions, then to wooden and tarp shacks. The contrast with his world of mansions and mirrored offices was brutal. "It's over there," Sophia pointed. to a structure that looked more like a heap of old planks and sheets of tin. The Blue Shack. Edward stopped the car and remained silent for a few seconds, trying to process what he saw. The shack Sophia had mentioned was even worse than he had imagined. The walls were made of old plywood, painted faded blue in some spots. The tin roof was clearly punctured in several places, patched with pieces of plastic tarp. A torn curtain served as a door. "Grandma Lourdes must be sleeping," Sophia whispered, noticing Edward's shocked expression. "She sleeps a lot because the medicine makes her tired, but she'll be happy to meet you." Edward got out of the car as if in a trance. The smell of open sewage mixed with wood smoke invaded his nostrils. Curious children began to approach, attracted by the luxurious car that completely contrasted with the environment. Some women appeared at their doorways, whispering among themselves about the well-dressed stranger who had arrived. Sophia gently pushed aside the curtain that served as a door. "Grandma Lourdes, graduation's over. I brought someone for you to meet." Edward entered what Sophia called a house and felt the air escape his lungs. The space was no more than 10 by 10 feet. The floor was packed earth, partially covered by pieces of old linoleum. In the corner, an rusty iron bed where an extremely thin old woman lay with sparse white hair and skin yellowed by illness. "My little granddaughter." Grandma Lourdes's voice was a hoarse whisper. "How was your graduation? Did you get your little diploma?" Sophia ran to the bed and proudly showed the diploma. "Look, Grandma, and look at the flowers I got, and there was chocolate for everyone." Edward stood by the entrance, observing the interaction between the two. There was so much genuine love in that tiny space that he felt like an intruder. Grandma Lourdes made a heroic effort to sit up in bed, supporting herself on trembling arms. "And who is this elegant gentleman?" she asked, her eyes still bright despite the evident illness. "Grandma, this is the mister who helped me at graduation." Sophia hesitated in her introduction, remembering their conversation in the car. "He pretended to be my dad so I wouldn't be alone." Grandma Lourdes studied Edward with the penetrating gaze of someone who had lived much and learned to read people. He approached slowly, feeling awkward in his expensive suit in that environment of extreme poverty. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Lourdes, just Lourdes," she completed with a toothless smile. "Sit here in the chair, sir. Sophia, get the gentleman a glass of water." Edward sat on the only available chair, an old, cracked plastic chair. Sophia disappeared behind a curtain that divided the space, and he could hear the sound of water being poured from a bucket. "Thank you for helping my girl," Grandma Lourdes said, her voice heavy with emotion. "She was so worried about this graduation. I wanted so badly to go, but..." She made a vague gesture to her own frail body. Edward noticed the purple bruises on her arms, signs that she bruised easily. He also noticed the way she gasped slightly, just from sitting up. "No need to thank me," Edward murmured, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "Anyone would do the same." "No, sir, they wouldn't," Grandma Lourdes corrected him gently. "I learned a long time ago that the world isn't generous to people like us. You did something special today." Sophia returned with a glass of water in a mismatched cup. Edward took a sip, trying not to think about the water's origin, and observed how she moved through the house with adult-like efficiency. She organized Grandma Lourdes' medicines, adjusted her pillow, checked if there was enough food for dinner. "Sophia told me you've been living here alone for a long time," Edward said, trying to start a conversation that would help him better understand the situation. "Since she was 6 months old," Grandma Lourdes confirmed. "I found her in a dumpster behind the Central Market, a tiny abandoned baby crying from hunger and cold. I couldn't just leave her there, could I?" Edward felt his stomach clench. Sophia had literally been thrown away like trash, and this sick old woman had saved her and raised her with love for over 6 years. You never tried to formalize the situation? Contact the proper authorities? Grandma Lourdes laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. Sir, do you think they'd let an 80-year-old who collects recyclables to sell keep a child? They'd take my Sophia to a group home in a heartbeat. Better she stay here with me, with little but with much love, than there with good food but no affection. Edward looked around again, trying to imagine Sophia growing up in that environment. He saw the makeshift bed she had mentioned, made of produce crates covered with a thin mattress. He saw the scarce toys, but carefully organized. He saw the walls decorated with drawings Sophia had made at school. And now? He asked, though he feared the answer. How are you managing? The silence that followed was eloquent. Sophia stopped tidying the medicines and looked at Grandma Lourdes, who sighed deeply. It's hard, sir. Very hard. I can't work anymore, and the money I had saved ran out with the medicine. Sophia is too young to work, but she helps me as much as she can. Sometimes neighbors give us something, but everyone here is in need. Edward felt as if he was being sucked into an emotional whirlpool. He had entered that house as a stranger, doing a one-time favor, but with each passing minute, he realized he was facing a situation that demanded much more than his presence at a school ceremony. Sophia approached him, still holding the diploma. Mister, thank you so much for helping me today. It was the happiest day of my life. And Edward knew at that moment that he couldn't simply leave and pretend that none of this had happened. Edward spent the entire night awake in his 3,000-square-foot penthouse, looking at the illuminated city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The contrast between his luxurious apartment and Sophia's shack tormented him. Every designer, furniture piece, every work of art on the walls, every detail that once represented his success now seemed like a silent accusation. In the morning, still in his silk pajamas, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He quickly dressed in casual clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, something he hadn't worn in years outside his home. He stopped at the city's most expensive supermarket and filled 2 bags with products he knew were missing from that house: milk, bread, fruit, basic medicines, cleaning supplies. The drive to the impoverished neighborhood in daylight revealed details that the previous afternoon's dim light had hidden. Open sewers, children playing among garbage, houses that looked ready to collapse. Edward drove slowly, aware of the curious glances his car attracted even on a Saturday morning. When he arrived at the blue shack, he found Sophia playing alone in the small space in front of the house, making paper dolls from old magazine pages. She looked up, and her face lit up with a pure joy that made him momentarily forget all his fears. "Mister, you came back." She ran to him but stopped halfway, as if remembering she should maintain a certain distance. "I brought some things for you," Edward said, carrying the bags. "How is Ms. Lourdes today?" "She's a little better. She managed to get up to make some tea." Sophia guided him into the house. "Grandma, look who's back." Grandma Lourdes was sitting on the bed, more alert than the day before. Her eyes lit up when she saw Edward with the groceries. "Sir, you didn't have to," she began, but her voice choked when she saw the quantity of items he had brought. Edward began taking products out of the bags, and Sophia exclaimed with joy at each item. Fresh fruits she hadn't seen in months, whole milk, soft bread, even some sweets he had impulsively included. "This will last a long time," exclaimed Sophia, hugging a box of colorful cereal as if it were a treasure. But Edward knew it wouldn't last. Those groceries would solve the problem for a few days, maybe a week. And then? Would he come back with more bags? How long could he sustain that situation? "Ms. Lourdes," he said, kneeling beside the bed, "have You considered seeking official help, social programs, proper medical assistance. The old woman's face immediately hardened. Sir, I already explained yesterday. If I show up at agencies asking for help, they'll want to know about Sophia's situation. They'll find out she's not officially my granddaughter, that she doesn't have proper documents, that she lives here with me without anything regularized. They'll take her away. Edward felt a knot in his stomach. The situation was even more complex than he had imagined. Sophia lived in a kind of legal limbo, protected only by the love of an old woman who was no longer able to care for herself. What if? He began, then stopped. What he was thinking was absolute madness. What if what, mister? Sophia approached, noticing his hesitation. Edward looked at that girl who had changed his life in less than 24 hours. He looked at Grandma Lourdes, who watched him with a mixture of hope and distrust. He thought about his empty life, his silent penthouse, all the years he had spent avoiding any emotional commitment. What if I... The words came out before his rational mind could stop them. What if I adopted Sophia? The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia's eyes widened. Grandma Lourdes opened her mouth without being able to make a sound. I mean, Edward continued, his voice gaining firmness as the idea solidified. I have resources, a large house. I can provide education, medical care. And you too, Miss Lourdes. I can ensure you get proper treatment, a dignified home. Mister, Sophia interrupted with a trembling voice. Are you serious? Do you really want to be my dad for real? The simple question hit him like a lightning bolt. He had spoken on impulse, but now that the words were out in the air, he realized they weren't just the product of an emotional moment. Somewhere deep in his heart, the idea made sense in a way that terrified him. He swallowed hard. I think so. I think I want to try. Grandma Lourdes began to cry silently. Sir, you don't know what you're offering. Sophia is a special girl, but raising a child, it's a huge responsibility. And there's all the legal stuff, the documents, the bureaucracy. I have lawyers, Edward replied, surprised by his own determination. I can handle the legal issues. And as for raising a child, well, I'll have to learn. But I can't just leave and pretend I didn't see how you live. Sophia approached slowly, as if fearing that any sudden movement might break the spell. If you adopt me, she asked with the seriousness of an adult, can I still see Grandma Lourdes? Will she be left alone? Edward felt his heart constrict. Even faced with the possibility of escaping extreme poverty, Sophia worried about the only family she had ever known. Of course, he replied without hesitation. Miss Lourdes is your family. We'll take care of her too. That's when he realized he had just changed not one life, but 3 lives forever. And for the first time in 8 years, since he decided never to allow himself to love anyone again, Edward Montgomery felt he was doing exactly what he should be doing. The fear was still there, immense and paralyzing. But greater than the fear was the certainty that he couldn't abandon that brave girl who had changed his world with a single desperate plea. So, he said, extending his hand to Sophia, how about we start working on the paperwork so you can officially be my daughter? Sophia took his hand with both of hers, small and warm, and smiled with a happiness that could light up the entire impoverished neighborhood. Monday arrived with reality knocking on Edward's door like a hammer. Sitting in his glass office on the 30th floor of one of the city's most expensive buildings, he stared at the pile of documents his lawyer had placed on the table. Each page represented a legal obstacle he hadn't anticipated when he made his impulsive offer over the weekend. Edward, Henry Miller, his lawyer for 15 years, looked at him with a mixed expression of concern and incredulity. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Adoption is already a complex process under normal circumstances, but this case, it's practically impossible. Edward leafed through the documents, trying to decipher the legal language that described all the complications. Sophia had no official birth certificate. Ms. Lourdes had never legally registered her guardianship. There was no paper proving any family ties between them. "Is there any chance?" Edward asked, knowing the answer wouldn't be what he wanted to. "Here. Minimal," the brutally honest lawyer replied. "First, we would have to regularize the child's situation with the state. That means involving Child Protective Services, the family court, social workers. They will question why a 7-year-old child was never officially registered." Edward felt his stomach clench. "And then?" "Then, if we can prove she's in a situation of abandonment or neglect, the state will assume temporary guardianship. She'll go to a shelter while they process the adoption papers. And then, my friend, you get in line like any other candidate." "What line?" "The line of people wanting to adopt children. And I can assure you that a 52-year-old single man with no experience with children is not at the top of judges' preferences." Edward got up and walked to the window, watching the city below. Somewhere in that sea of buildings and houses, Sophia was probably helping Grandma Lourdes, organizing medicines, doing household chores that a 7-year-old child shouldn't have to do. How long would this whole process take? If we're lucky, 2 years? Realistically, 3 to 5 years, and that's assuming everything works out in the end. And during that time, Sophia would stay in a shelter? Probably, yes. Edward closed his eyes. The image of Sophia in a shelter, separated from Grandma Lourdes, separated from the only love she had known in her life, was unbearable. "There has to be another way," he murmured. "Edward," Henry Miller approached, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "May I ask why this is so important to you? You've always avoided any kind of family commitment. Why is this child different?" Edward didn't know how to explain, how to describe the moment when a desperate girl had broken walls he thought were indestructible. How to explain that for the first time in years he had felt that his life had a purpose greater than accumulating money. "She reminds me that there are things more important than financial success," he finally said, "and I can't abandon her now." The office phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The secretary announced an urgent call from Sophia's school. Edward answered, his heart racing. "Mr. Montgomery?" It was Ms. Marsh's voice, but it sounded different, worried. "I need to speak with you about Sophia. She didn't come to school today." "What do you mean she didn't come?" "We called the number on her file, but no one answered." "She never misses classes, sir. We're concerned." Edward hung up the phone and grabbed his car. Keys before even explaining to the lawyer. 20 minutes later, he was rushing down the dirt road toward the blue shack, his heart pounding. He found Sophia sitting outside the house, crying silently. When she saw him, she ran into his arms as if he were her only salvation. "Mr. Grandma! Lourdes isn't able to get out of bed today. She's very weak and I don't know what to do." Edward entered the house and saw Grandma Lourdes in a much worse state than on previous days. Her breathing was labored, her lips had a worrying bluish tint, and she could barely open her eyes. "She needs to go to the hospital," he said, more to himself than to Sophia. "But she doesn't want to go," Sophia sobbed. "She says if she goes to the hospital, they'll find out about me. They'll take me away." Edward knelt beside the bed and held Grandma Lourdes' trembling hand. "Miss Lourdes, you need medical care. I promise I will take care of Sophia." The old woman's eyes opened with effort. "Sir, if I go, take care of my girl. Don't let them take her." "I promise," Edward said. And for the first time in his life, a promise completely terrified him. He called a private ambulance, using his contacts to ensure discretion. While they waited, he held Sophia in his arms, feeling her tremble with fear and exhaustion. "Mister," she whispered. "If Grandma Lourdes leaves, will I really be alone?" Edward looked at that brave girl who had carried responsibilities too heavy for her age and made a decision that would change everything. "No," he said with a firmness that surprised even himself. "You will never be alone again, I promise." But as the ambulance drove away with Grandma Lourdes, Edward knew he had just promised something he might not be able to keep. The legal obstacles were just the beginning. From now on, he would have to fight the entire system to keep Sophia safe. And he didn't even know where to begin. With Grandma Lourdes hospitalized, Sophia spent the first night of her life in Edward's penthouse. She walked through the immense rooms, as if in a museum, delicately touching expensive objects, whispering "wow" at each new discovery. The marble bathtub was larger than the entire shack where she lived, and she asked if she could really use those towels as soft as clouds. Edward prepared the guest room for her, but when he went to check if everything was all right, he found Sophia curled up in an armchair in the living room, looking out the giant window. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. "It's very different here," she murmured. "Very quiet. In our house, there's always noise from the neighbors, children playing, dogs barking. Here it's too quiet. It makes me think about Grandma Lourdes, alone in the hospital." Edward felt a pang in his chest. He had become so accustomed to the luxurious silence of his life that he had forgotten how haunting it could be for a child used to the warmth of community. "How about we call the hospital to see how she's doing?" Sophia's eyes lit up. The call brought good news. Grandma Lourdes was stable, responding well to treatment, and could receive visitors the next day. The next morning, Edward had to take Sophia to school before going to work. The comments began the moment they stepped out of the Mercedes in front of the gate of Northwood Elementary School. "Girls, look," whispered one of the mothers to her friend. "It's that rich man again, and the girl has new clothes." Sophia was indeed different. Edward had insisted on buying some basic clothes for her, and now she wore a simple but good quality dress, new shoes, and a backpack that wasn't patched with duct tape. "Good morning, Miss Marcia," Edward greeted the educator, who welcomed him with a relieved smile. "It's good that Sophia is well. We were very worried yesterday. How is her grandma?" "Hospitalized but stable," Edward replied. "Sophia will stay with me while Miss Lourdes recovers." The teacher nodded, but Edward noticed a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Other mothers approached, feigning casual conversations, but clearly interested in the situation. "What a coincidence that you showed up just when Sophia's family needed it most," one of them commented, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Edward felt a shiver of discomfort, but merely nodded politely before saying goodbye to Sophia with a kiss on her forehead, a gesture that came naturally, surprising them both. During the day, while Edward tried to concentrate on business meetings, rumors spread through the impoverished community where Sophia lived. Neighbors who had seen the luxurious car in recent days began to speculate about the rich man's true intentions. "This is very strange," murmured Ms. Rosa, the neighborhood gossip, to a group of women. "At the local convenience store, a rich man appears out of nowhere, interested in a poor orphaned girl. What kind of interest could that be?" "Yeah, and now that Lourdes is in the hospital, he's already taken the girl to his house," another added. "A pretty girl like Sophia, a rich single man. Something's fishy about this story." The whispers grew like wildfire. Each conversation added a new detail, a darker suspicion. When Edward picked Sophia up from school in the late afternoon, he noticed that the gazes had changed. They were no longer just curious, they were suspicious, some clearly hostile. Sophia noticed the difference too. During the drive to the hospital, she remained quiet, unlike her usual chattiness. "Did something happen at school today?" Edward asked. "The kids ask strange questions," she replied softly. They asked if you were really my dad, why you only showed up now, why you have so much money." Edward sighed. He had been naive to think they could keep the situation simple and discreet. At the hospital, they found Grandma Lourdes visibly better, sitting up in bed and talking to a nurse. Her eyes lit up when she saw Sophia, but Edward noticed how she carefully scrutinized the new clothes the girl wore. "How are you feeling with Mr. Edward, my dear?" Grandma Lourdes asked after the nurse left. "It's really good, Grandma. His house is huge. There's a bed just for me, and he even let me choose what I wanted for lunch." Sophia spoke with enthusiasm, but Edward noticed the concern in Grandma Lourdes' eyes. Later, when Sophia went to the bathroom, Grandma Lourdes held Edward's arm. "Sir, I'm hearing some bad comments. People in the community are speaking ill of you, inventing ugly stories about your intentions with Sophia." "What kind of stories?" Edward asked, though he feared the answer. "They say a rich man doesn't help a poor child without wanting something in return. They're spreading that you might have other intentions with her." Edward felt his blood run cold. The implication was clear and revolting. "Miss Lourdes, I would never—" "I know, sir. I look in your eyes, and I see you're a good person. But people don't know you like I do, and there are ill-intentioned people who might use this gossip to cause harm. What do you think I should do?" Grandma Lourdes remained silent for long minutes. "Maybe it's better if you stay away for a while. Let things cool down. When I leave the hospital, things will go back to normal, and the comments will stop." Edward looked out the hospital window, seeing Sophia play in the small garden she had discovered. The girl laughed for the first time in days, chasing a butterfly, and he realized he couldn't simply disappear from her life. "I can't do that," he said finally. "I can't abandon her now. If people want to talk, let them talk, but I won't run away." Grandma Lourdes nodded slowly. "Then be prepared, sir, because when gossip spreads in a community, it can turn into a snowball. And sometimes that snowball turns into an avalanche." Edward didn't yet know how prophetic those words were. The call came on Thursday morning, while Edward was trying to teach Sophia how to use the penthouse intercom so she could safely play in the building's playground. The formal voice on the other end of the line made his stomach drop. "Mr. Edward Montgomery, this is Carla Jenkins from Child Protective Services. We've received some anonymous reports about a minor who is allegedly under your care. We need to schedule a visit to verify the situation." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the world collapse around him. Ms. Lourdes' words about the avalanche echoed in his mind. "What kind of reports?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can we schedule it for this afternoon? It's a situation that requires urgency." 2 hours later, Edward waited in his penthouse living room, beside Sophia, who was playing with a new jigsaw puzzle he had bought. She didn't know what was happening, and he didn't have the heart to explain that strangers were coming to question her about her life. The doorbell rang and Sophia ran to open it, but Edward gently held her back. "Let me get it, Princess. These are people who came to talk with us." Carla Jenkins was a middle-aged woman with a serious expression and a folder full of papers. She was accompanied by a younger man who introduced himself as a social worker. Both observed the luxurious penthouse with professional glances, jotting down details on their clipboards. "Sophia?" Carla addressed the girl in a gentle yet formal voice. "I'm Carla, and I'm here to talk with you for a little while. Is that okay?" Sophia looked at Edward, who nodded encouragingly, though his heart was pounding. "Can you tell me how you met Mr. Montgomery?" Carla asked, sitting down at the child's height. "He helped me at my graduation," Sophia replied sincerely. "I asked him to pretend to be my dad because I didn't have anyone to go with me. And after the graduation, what happened? He came to my house to meet Grandma Lourdes. He brought food and medicine for us. When Grandma got sick, he took her to the hospital and said he would take care of me." Edward realized how Sophia's innocent answers could sound suspicious to wary ears. A child being helped by an unknown rich man, taken to a luxurious penthouse after her only relative was hospitalized. "Sophia," Carla continued, "has Mr. Montgomery ever done anything that made you uncomfortable? Anything that seemed strange to you?" Sophia's eyes widened, and she looked confusedly at Edward. "Strange how?" "Anything. Maybe he asked you not to tell anyone about something you did together?" "No," Sophia replied, increasingly confused. "He's just very kind. He lets me choose what I want to eat. He bought me new clothes, and yesterday he taught me how to play a game on his tablet." The social worker noted everything, and Edward realized how every kindness could be interpreted as an attempt to win the child's trust. "Mr. Montgomery," Carla turned to him, "can you explain exactly what your relationship with this child is?" Edward took a deep breath. "We have no familial relationship whatsoever. I met Sophia a week ago when she asked me to accompany her to her school graduation. After seeing the conditions she was living in, I offered help. And what exactly is your intention with this help?" "I've initiated an adoption process. I want to formalize Sophia's guardianship and ensure she has access to the education, health care, and opportunities she deserves." Carla and the social worker exchanged significant glances. "Mr. Montgomery, are you aware that to adopt a child in the United States there's a specific legal process? You can't just decide to keep a minor." "I am aware, yes. My lawyer is already handling the necessary paperwork." "And Ms. Lourdes, what exactly is her situation regarding the child?" Edward hesitated. This was the question he feared. "Ms. Lourdes has cared for Sophia since she was a baby, but there's no official documentation of that guardianship." The silence that followed was eloquent. Carla closed her clipboard with a crisp snap. "Mr. Montgomery, I need to inform you that Sophia is in an irregular situation. A minor cannot remain under the care of someone without a family tie or court authorization." Sophia approached Edward, sensing the tension in the air. "What does that mean?" she asked in a small voice. Carla knelt in front of her again. "Sophia, you'll need to come with us for a few days until we sort out this whole situation." "Go where?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears instantly. "To a place where other children stay while the adults sort out the paperwork. It's just temporary." "No!" Sophia ran to Edward, clinging to his leg. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with Mr. Edward and Grandma Lourdes." Edward felt his heart shatter. He knelt and held Sophia by the shoulders. "Sophia, look at me. I promised. I wouldn't abandon you. Remember, I'll fix this, but you might have to stay away from me for a few days. You promised," she sobbed. "You promised I'd never be alone again." Sophia's words echoed through the luxurious room like an accusation. Edward looked at the social workers, seeing the distrust on their faces. To them, he was just another adult breaking promises to a vulnerable child. "Mr. Montgomery," Carla said, firmly, "you have 15 minutes to pack Sophia's things, and I ask that you don't make this any harder for her than it already is." Edward knew he had lost the first battle. But as he helped Sophia put away her few new clothes, he whispered in her ear, "I'll come get you. No matter how long it takes, I'll come get you." Sophia just cried, clinging to her graduation diploma as if it were the last connection to the only happy moment she had lived. The Harmony House shelter was a faded yellow 2-story building with bars on the windows and a small yard surrounded by high walls. Edward parked outside, watching children playing in the limited space, desperately searching for Sophia among them. 3 days had passed since she had been taken, 3 days during which Edward had slept only a few hours, alternating between meetings with lawyers and frustrated attempts to visit her. The bureaucratic process was an implacable machine, and he was learning the hard way that money couldn't always accelerate justice. "Mr. Montgomery?" A woman approached the fence, I'm Mariana, the shelter coordinator. Are you here to visit Sophia? Edward nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. How is she? Well, considering the circumstances. She's a strong girl, but, well, you can see for yourself. Sophia was sitting alone in a corner of the yard, drawing on the ground with a stick. Her new clothes were already wrinkled and dirty, and she had lost the sparkle in her eyes that Edward had come to associate with her vibrant personality. "Sophia!" he called through the fence. She looked up and ran to him, pressing her small hands against the cold metal. "Mr. Edward, did you come to get me?" The hope in her voice was like a stab in his chest. "Not yet, Princess, but I'm working on it. How are you?" "There are lots of kids here," she said, trying to sound brave. "Some are nice, but I want to go home. I want to see Grandma Lourdes." Edward knelt to be at her height through the fence. "Grandma Lourdes is much better. The doctors said she can leave the hospital next week." "And then I can leave here?" Edward hesitated. That was the question that tormented him. Even when Ms. Lourdes left the hospital, Sophia's legal situation would remain irregular. Child Protective Services wouldn't simply return her to the elderly sick woman. "We're working on it," was all he could say. Later, in Henry Miller's office, Edward faced the brutal reality of his situation. On the table, piles of documents represented weeks of legal work, but progress was discouragingly slow. "The news isn't good," the lawyer admitted. "In addition to the normal legal issues of adoption, we now have to deal with the suspicions raised by the anonymous reports." "What suspicions?" "They investigated and found nothing." "Edward, you have to understand how this looks to the authorities. A rich, single man with no history with children appears out of nowhere wanting to adopt a poor girl. Some judges will question your motivations, regardless of whether you're innocent." Edward got up and began pacing. "So what are you telling me, that I should give up?" "I'm saying we need a different strategy. And perhaps we need to consider some concessions." "What kind of concessions?" Henry Miller sighed deeply. "And there's a possibility you could get temporary guardianship initially. That would be faster than a full adoption. Sophia could leave the shelter and live with you, but under state supervision." "Supervision?" "Regular visits from social workers, periodic reports, psychological evaluations. Your private life would be constantly monitored." Edward stopped pacing. The idea of having strangers invading his home regularly, questioning every interaction with Sophia, judging every parental decision, was suffocating. But the alternative was to leave her in the shelter indefinitely. How long would this supervision last? At least 2 years. If everything goes well, you could request final adoption after that period. And Miss Lourdes, where does she fit into all this? That's another problem. Technically, she has no legal rights over Sophia, but if we can prove there was a de facto family bond, even without documentation, perhaps we can establish a visitation arrangement. Edward returned to the window, looking at the city stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Sophia was learning to live without hope, adapting to the routine of a shelter, perhaps starting to believe that he had broken his promise. "There's one more thing," Henry Miller continued hesitantly. "A journalist has been asking questions about you and Sophia. It seems someone is feeding information to the press." "What kind of information?" "Speculations about your motivations, conspiracy, theories about rich men buying poor children. It's cheap sensationalism, but it could complicate our situation even further." Edward felt a wave of anger. "Who's doing this?" "We don't know. It could be someone from the community where Sophia lived, someone who feels wronged by your interference in her life, or it could simply be tabloid opportunism. What do we do?" "For now, we don't give interviews. We don't respond to provocations. We let the legal work speak for itself." "But Edward, You need to understand. If this story leaks to the media in a distorted way, it could destroy any chance we have." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a battle that was just beginning. Each day that passed, Sophia spent more time in the shelter, further from the life he had promised to give her. And now, in addition to the legal barriers, he would have to fight against public opinion and possible sabotage. How long do you need to secure at least temporary guardianship? If all goes well, maybe 6 weeks. But Edward, I can't guarantee anything. A suspicious judge, a negative press story, anything can delay the process for months. Edward thought of Sophia, drawing alone on the shelter floor, holding tightly to that graduation diploma as her only memory of a happy day. "Then we'd better get to work," he said with determination, "because I'm not going to break my promise to her, no matter how long it takes, no matter what battles I have to fight." But as he left the office, Edward knew he was entering the most difficult fight of his life, and there were no guarantees of victory. The county courthouse was packed on Tuesday morning. Edward never imagined that a minor guardianship hearing could attract so much attention. Reporters squeezed into the back benches, discreet cameras captured every movement, and curious onlookers who had read about the case in local newspapers whispered malicious speculations. That morning's newspaper headline still burned in his mind. "Wealthy businessman tries to buy orphaned child. Community denounces suspicious intentions." Sophia was sitting next to the attorney appointed by the state to represent her, a young woman who treated her with professional but distant kindness. The girl wore a simple dress provided by the shelter and held her graduation diploma in her hands, which had become her talisman amidst all that turbulence. Edward observed her from across the room, noticing how she had lost weight in recent weeks. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity and joy, now carried a sadness that seemed too great for a 7-year-old child. "All rise," announced the bailiff. "The Family and Juvenile Court is now in session, presided over by the Honorable Judge Robert Sterling." The judge was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression that revealed nothing of his intentions. He examined the documents on his desk for long minutes before looking up. "We are here to decide on the situation of the minor Sophia Mendes, currently under state custody," he began in a firm voice. "Mr. Edward Montgomery requests temporary guardianship of said minor, claiming intent for future adoption." Edward rose when called, feeling the weight of all eyes on him. "Your Honor, my intention is genuine. I want to offer Sophia a stable home, quality education, and all the love a child deserves." "Mr. Montgomery," the judge interrupted him, "you are 52 years old, single, with no prior experience with children. Why specifically this child?" The question echoed through the silent courtroom. Edward took a deep breath, knowing his answer could determine Sophia's future. "Your Honor, Sophia taught me something I had long forgotten. She showed me that there is something more important than professional success or material wealth. When she asked me for help that afternoon, I saw in her eyes a courage and a determination that deeply touched me. She wasn't asking for money or gifts. She was just asking not to be alone at an important moment in her life." The judge made notes in his notepad. "And are you aware of the responsibilities this entails?" "Completely aware, Your Honor. And I am prepared to dedicate my life to being the father Sophia deserves." It was then that the prosecutor rose. District Attorney Eleanor Vance was known for her rigorous stance in cases involving minors. "Your Honor, we cannot ignore the suspicious circumstances of this case. A wealthy man appears out of nowhere in the life of a vulnerable child, offers expensive gifts, takes her to his luxurious residence. We have a pattern here that cannot be ignored." Edward felt his blood boil, but Henry Miller held his arm, signaling for him to keep calm. "Furthermore, The prosecutor continued, "We have received reports from the community where the child lived, indicating legitimate concerns about the petitioner's true motivations." "Your Honor," Henry Miller stood up, "these are unfounded speculations based on social prejudice. My client has undergone all necessary psychological evaluations, has a clean record, and has demonstrated a genuine interest in the minor's well-being." The judge rapped his gavel, calling for silence. "I would like to hear from the minor." Sophia was called forward. She walked slowly, holding tightly to her diploma. When she reached the witness stand, her voice came out tiny, but clear. "Your Honor," Sophia's appointed attorney said, "the minor has repeatedly expressed her desire to stay with Mr. Montgomery." "Sophia," the judge addressed her directly, lowering his voice, "can you tell me how you feel about Mr. Montgomery?" Sophia looked at Edward, then at the judge. "He's the first person who didn't lie to me," she said, with a sincerity that cut everyone in the courtroom to the core. "When he promised he would take care of me, I believed him. And even when they took me from him, I still believe him. And why do you believe him? Because he could have left after my graduation and pretended he never saw me. But he didn't. He met Grandma Lourdes. He saw how we lived, and he still wanted to stay." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "Sophia," the judge continued gently, "do you understand that if you go live with Mr. Montgomery, people will visit you regularly to make sure everything is okay?" "Yes, sir. But I prefer that to staying at the shelter. There are nice kids there, but it's not a real family." It was. Then that Ms. Lourdes entered the courtroom, supported by a cane and visibly frail but determined. Edward hadn't expected to see her there. She had been discharged from the hospital only 2 days before. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said in a trembling but firm voice. "May I speak about my granddaughter?" The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Your Honor," Ms. Lourdes addressed the judge with the respect of someone who grew up fearing authorities, "I raised this girl since she was a tiny baby. I don't have the signed papers, that's true, but I have love. And when I saw that, I couldn't properly care for her. Anymore, I prayed to God to send someone." She looked at Edward with tears in her eyes. "This man appeared when we needed it most. He could have given money and left, but he stayed. He saw Sophia crying and couldn't abandon her. If that's not a father's love, I don't know what is." A murmur grew in the courtroom, but the judge rapped his gavel again. "The court will take a 15-minute recess for deliberation." When the judge left, Edward approached Sophia. She ran into his arms, and he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Whatever the decision," he whispered in her ear, "I won't give up on you." Sophia just nodded, burying her and face in his chest, preparing to hear words that would change her life forever. The 15-minute recess felt like an eternity. Edward remained in the courthouse hallway, holding Sophia in his arms as she nervously played with her crumpled diploma. Ms. Lourdes was sitting on a nearby bench, clearly exhausted from the effort of coming all this way, but with her eyes shining with determination. Reporters tried to approach for questions, but Henry Miller kept them at bay. The lawyer was visibly tense, mentally reviewing all the arguments that could have strengthened or harmed the case. "Mr. Edward," Sophia whispered, "if the judge says I have to stay at the shelter, will you forget about me?" Edward held her tighter. "Never, Princess. Even if it takes years, I will keep fighting to have you with me. That's a promise that nothing and no one can make me break. All rise." The bailiff announced the judge's return. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Robert Sterling resumed his seat. He observed everyone present for long seconds before beginning to speak. "This is one of the most complex cases I have ever reviewed," the judge began, his voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. "We have a situation here that challenges legal and social conventions, but at its heart is something very simple: the well-being of a child." Edward felt his heart race. Sophia clung tighter to his hand. After reviewing all psychological, social, and legal reports, after hearing all testimonies and considering all evidence presented, I come to the following conclusions. The judge paused dramatically. First, I found no evidence to support the suspicions raised about Mr. Edward Montgomery's intentions. On the contrary, all evaluations indicate a man of integrity, with a genuine interest in the minor's well-being. A murmur of relief swept through the part of the courtroom where Edward's supporters were. Second, the emotional bond between the petitioner and the minor is evident and healthy. Sophia clearly demonstrates her preference to remain under Mr. Montgomery's care. Sophia squeezed Edward's hand, barely containing her hope. Third, I acknowledge the fundamental role Ms. Lourdes has played in this child's life. Although there is no legal documentation, the emotional bond is unquestionable and must be preserved. Ms. Lourdes wiped away tears with the back of her trembling hand. Therefore, the judge continued, I partially grant the request for guardianship. Mr. Edward Montgomery will have temporary guardianship of the minor, Sophia Mendez, for an initial period of 2 years with the following conditions. Edward could barely breathe. First condition, monthly visits from social workers to monitor the situation. Second condition, Sophia will maintain regular contact with Ms. Lourdes, considering her as an affectionate grandmother. Third condition, after the 2-year period, if everything proceeds adequately, Mr. Montgomery may request final adoption. The courtroom erupted in diverse reactions. Some applauded, others protested. Reporters furiously took notes. Sophia looked at Edward with shining eyes. Does that mean I can go home with you? Yes, Princess, Edward replied. His voice choked with emotion. You can come home. She let out a cry of joy and threw herself into his arms, the diploma finally. Falling to the floor, Edward lifted her, spinning her in the air as tears of happiness streamed down his face. Fourth and final condition, the judge said, rapping his gavel to restore order. Mr. Montgomery must provide all necessary documentation to officially regularize the minor's civil status, including a birth certificate and other identity documents. I accept all conditions, Your Honor, Edward said formally, though his voice trembled with emotion. Ms. Lourdes slowly approached, supported by her cane. Sophia got down from Edward's arms and ran to hug her. Grandma, now I have a real family, but you'll still be my grandma forever. Of course, my dear, Ms. Lourdes whispered, stroking the girl's hair. And now you have a father who will care for you as you deserve. She looked up at Edward. Thank you, sir, for everything. Edward knelt in front of her. Thank you, Ms. Lourdes, for caring for her, for giving me the chance to meet her, for teaching me what truly matters in life. Henry Miller approached with the papers for signing. Edward, do you realize what just happened? You didn't just win guardianship of Sophia, you set an important legal precedent for similar cases. But Edward barely heard the lawyer's words. He was watching Sophia show her diploma to Ms. Lourdes, excitedly telling her about living in the penthouse, about the room that would be all hers, about the books they could read together. Leaving the courthouse, Edward carried Sophia in his arms as they walked toward the car. Reporters surrounded them, but he didn't answer any questions. There was only one thing he wanted to say. Sophia, he said, opening the car door, ready to go home. Our home, she corrected, smiling like he hadn't seen in weeks. Our home, he repeated, knowing that those 2 simple words represented the greatest victory of his life. As they drove through the city, Sophia chattered about all the plans she had made during her days at the shelter. Edward listened with a smile on his face, realizing that his life had finally found a purpose that no fortune could buy. In the penthouse, Sophia ran to the room Edward had prepared, especially for her. decorated with cheerful colors and filled with new toys. But she quickly returned to the living room, carrying only one thing, her graduation diploma. Daddy, she tested the word carefully. Can I frame my diploma? It's where everything began. Edward smiled, finally understanding that sometimes the greatest miracles are born from the simplest and most desperate pleas. 2.5 years later, on a sunny Thursday afternoon, very much like the one that changed their lives forever, Edward parked the same black Mercedes in front of Northwood Elementary School. But this time, everything was different. Sophia jumped out of the back seat, now almost 10 years old, taller, and with a confident smile that radiated genuine happiness. She wore the impeccable uniform of the private school she attended, but had insisted on returning to the public school that special day for a presentation on overcoming adversity that she herself had proposed. "Daddy," she said naturally, a word that had become music to Edward's ears. "Do you think the kids will like my story?" "I'm sure they will, Princess," Edward replied, adjusting the small tie she had insisted on wearing to look more formal. "Your story can inspire many children who are going through difficulties." Ms. Marcia greeted them at the gate with a warm smile. In recent years, she had closely followed Sophia's transformation and had become one of the greatest advocates for the family they had built. "Sophia, how you've grown!" exclaimed the teacher. "And how is Miss Lourdes?" "Grandma Lourdes is great," Sophia replied excitedly. "She lives in a beautiful little house Daddy bought near our house. She has a nurse who takes care of her, and I visit her every weekend. We make fudge brownies together." Edward smiled, remembering the cozy house he had bought for Miss Lourdes, a simple but dignified place with a garden where she could grow her flowers and receive friends for conversation. The old woman's transformation had been almost as dramatic as Sophia's. With adequate medical care and the peace of mind knowing her granddaughter was safe, she had regained much of her vitality. In the schoolyard, children of various ages gathered to listen to Sophia. She stood in the same spot where, years earlier, she had received her first diploma from her father's hands. On the wall behind her, a golden plaque announced the Sophia Montgomery Family Assistance Program, a social project Edward had created to identify and help children in vulnerable situations. "Hi, everyone," Sophia began with the natural ease of someone who had learned to express herself with confidence. "My name is Sophia, and I want to tell you how a very terrifying plea turned into the greatest blessing of my life." Edward watched from the back of the yard, alongside Henry Miller and Carla Jenkins from Child Protective Services, who had become an ally after closely following Sophia's development in recent years. "A few years ago, I went to school here," Sophia continued. "I lived in a shack with Grandma Lourdes, who was very sick on the day of my kindergarten graduation. I was so afraid of being the only child without family." The children listened with rapt attention. Many of them knew the feeling of feeling different, abandoned, without hope. "Then I saw an elegant man getting into his car, and I ran to him. I asked him, with my heart pounding so hard, if he could pretend to be my dad just for that day." Sophia looked at Edward, her eyes shining with gratitude. "He could have said no. He could have driven away and pretended he never saw me. But you know what he did? He came back. He brought flowers and chocolate for everyone. And then he found out we needed much more than just a pretty graduation." Edward felt a lump in his throat, remembering that first moment of hesitation when he had almost fled from the responsibility Sophia represented. "Today I have a real family," Sophia said, her voice growing more emotional. "I have a dad who takes me to school, helps me with homework, and who never ever breaks his promises. Grandma Lourdes has a beautiful house and all the medicine she needs. And I learned that sometimes, when you're brave enough to ask for help, incredible things can happen. A little girl in the first row raised her hand. What if the person says no? Sophia smiled wisely. Then you ask someone else, and another, until you find someone with a heart big enough to help, because good people exist, even when it seems they don't. After the presentation, several children approached Sophia to ask questions. Edward watched her interact naturally, giving hugs and words of encouragement to the younger ones. She's a special girl, Carla Jenkins commented. You've built something beautiful together. She taught me more than I could ever teach her, Edward replied. She showed me that there are forms of wealth that cannot be measured in money. Later, in the car on the way home, Sophia played with the same graduation diploma, now framed and a little faded by time. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "do you regret stopping the car that day?" Edward laughed. "Sophia, that was the best day of my life. It was the day I discovered that family isn't about blood, but about love and choice. And you chose to stay with me even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, because that's when I discovered you were worth any fight." When they arrived at the penthouse, Ms. Lourdes was waiting for them in the living room, more radiant than Edward had seen her in months. Her white hair was neatly combed, she wore a new dress, and there was a special sparkle in her eyes. "Grandma!" Sophia ran to hug her. "How was your presentation at school?" "It was amazing, Grandma. The kids asked a lot of questions, and I told them our whole story." Ms. Lourdes stroked the girl's face with infinite tenderness. "My granddaughter became a famous speaker," she said proudly. "Who would have thought that shy little girl I found in a dumpster would grow up to inspire other children?" Edward approached and kissed Ms. Lourdes' forehead, a gesture that had become natural over the years. "How was your doctor's appointment today, Ms. Lourdes?" "Excellent. The doctor said I'm getting stronger every day. He even joked that at 88 I have the energy of a 70-year-old. They laughed together, three people who had found a unique and perfect way to be a family. That night, when Sophia was already asleep, Edward stood in his office looking at the photos on the wall. Sophia on her first day of her new school. Sophia and Ms. Lourdes making fudge brownies. Sophia receiving an award for best student in her class. Dozens of moments that documented the extraordinary journey they had traveled together. But his favorite photo remained the first one. Sophia on graduation day, holding her diploma and smiling next to him in the Northwood Elementary School yard. It was where it all began, where a desperate little girl and a lonely man discovered that sometimes the most improbable encounters create the truest families. Edward picked up the phone and dialed Henry Miller's number. "Henry, it's Edward. I think it's time to file for final adoption. I want Sophia to be officially my daughter." "Finally!" the lawyer chuckled on the other end of the line. "I've been waiting for that call for months. With your exemplary record, it should be much simpler this time." Edward hung up and went to check on Sophia in her room. She slept peacefully, hugging a teddy bear he had given her on their first Children's Day together. On the bedside table, the framed diploma caught the lamplight, reminding him every day that the greatest miracles can be born from the simplest pleas. "Thank you," Edward whispered to no one in particular, perhaps to destiny, perhaps to the courage of a 7-year-old girl who had changed his life forever. Sophia stirred in her sleep and mumbled something that sounded like, "Daddy!" And Edward knew he had found his true wealth, a family built not by blood ties, but by choice, love, and the willingness to fight for those we love. In the silence of the night, he could almost hear the echo of that desperate little voice on the afternoon that changed everything. "Mister, could you be my dad at my graduation?" And for the 1,000th time, Edward smiled, knowing he had given the only possible answer, yes.